In 2024, people decide to recreate the legendary Titanic for a new voyage, but strange and terrifying events begin to unfold on board. The events of the film take us back to 1912, during the Titanic's tragic sinking. A young woman named Elizabeth escapes from the sinking ship, desperately calling for her fiancé, Charles, but he doesn't respond. The ship's captain pushes her into a lifeboat, which is lowered into the water. However, the cables holding the lifeboat snap, and it capsizes, throwing everyone into the water. Elizabeth manages to climb onto the overturned lifeboat, calling for Charles once again. To her surprise, he answers from a nearby iceberg. Determined to save her, the young man jumps into the water. Elizabeth peers desperately into the dark waves, but suddenly, a reanimated corpse emerges from the depths and drags her down into the abyss. 110 years after the sinking of the original Titanic, the Titanic III embarks on a new voyage along the same route as its predecessor. A journalist explains that the ship will stop at the site of the infamous disaster that claimed over 1,500 lives. A man and woman, arriving at the dock in a car, eagerly gaze out the window. The man is in awe of the ship and suggests his companion put down her phone and look at it. Grumbling that the people who built the ship are profiting from a tragedy, the woman finally looks up, noticing the man is filming. He begins to gush over Titanic III. When they step out of the car, they are immediately surrounded by fans of their blog, eager to take photos. After posing for a few pictures, they record an excited video for their followers before boarding the ship. Meanwhile, Captain of the Titanic III introduces his team, including Brian Andrews, a former Navy SEAL who has assembled a special team to ensure additional safety. He will answer both to the captain and Hector, the head of security. Although there is already security on board, extra personnel will help, especially with the large number of passengers and the relics from the original Titanic. Wishing everyone a good day at work, the woman dismisses the team to their stations. On the bridge, the captain gives orders to start the engines and set sail. Meanwhile, on deck, the passengers are celebrating the successful departure. Once the ship is at sea, a young woman emerges from one of the luggage trunks. She quietly walks through the ship's lower decks, finding a room to unpack her things. On deck, the blogger couple records another video for their followers, then decides to greet other passengers. After exiting the cargo hold, the young woman carefully navigates the ship's corridors. In one of the rooms, she finds a crew uniform and takes it. Julie McKenna, over the loudspeaker, introduces herself as the crew's organizer. She announces that the ship has been meticulously recreated over 10 years by master craftsmen, with generous sponsors donating authentic items from the site of the original Titanic wreck. Tomorrow evening, Captain Rose will lead everyone to the Titanic's final resting place, where they will observe a moment of silence in honor of those who witnessed the tragic event. For now, she wishes everyone an enjoyable stay. An unknown girl, disguised in the crew uniform, sneaks into a museum room. Approaching a cabinet with a violin, she carefully takes it in her hands, ensuring no one is nearby. Just then, a man enters the room. He shouts at her, demanding she put the violin down immediately. It is the most valuable piece in his collection, the violin that played nearer, my God, to thee when the Titanic sank. The violin had lain at the bottom of the ocean for 100 years, and he doesn't want some low-level staff member ruining it. Julie, who is nearby, tries to calm the man down. Meanwhile, the girl notices a hairpin in a nearby cabinet. She remarks that her great-grandmother had one just like it. She is furious that the man has stolen items from the site of the Titanic's final resting place, reminding him that ancient Egyptians were buried with their treasures and those who touched them were cursed with death. The man, irritated by this strange girl, asks Julie who she is. Julie, unsure, just asks the girl to leave. While the man and Julie are distracted, the girl quietly takes the hairpin with a coin and leaves. The bloggers continue recording various videos for their channel. While filming, the man accidentally bumps into someone, apologizing for his clumsiness. He hears a harsh retort in response and is advised to stop staring at his phone. The woman steps in and tells the man that it was he who ran into them. The man immediately turns to compliment her, which greatly displeases her companion, and they move on to explore the ship. The mysterious girl returns to the lower decks. Meanwhile, the bloggers continue to wander the corridors and accidentally bump into Brian. Mia and Jackson tell him they're a bit lost, and he gives them directions. A professor is speaking with a passenger, showing him a wedding ring that once belonged to Captain Edward Smith. The man immediately expresses interest in acquiring it and asks how much it costs. The professor disappoints him, saying the ring is not for sale but offers a few other items the man might want to purchase. After shaking hands, the two men go to look at the relics. In the lower deck, the girl begins performing a ritual. She pulls a photo of Captain Edward Smith from her bag and calls on the spirits of death. Meanwhile, a grand gala concert begins in the ballroom. Captain Rose is in her cabin getting dressed while video chatting with her fiancé. Mia and Jackson, still exploring the ship, enter one of the rooms. They are in awe of the surroundings when they notice the girl performing the ritual. Unable to understand what she is doing, they start to leave when she cuts her hand. Deciding it's best to get away, the door behind them suddenly slams open with a loud noise. Startled, they turn around to see their fan, Nancy, who had been watching their live stream and decided to join them. The girl, completely unaware of the audience, continues her ritual. Suddenly, the walls of the ship begin to shake, and the blogger's camera cuts out. Seeing all this, Jackson suggests they get as far away as possible from this strange woman. Mia and Nancy follow him. Captain Rose is preparing for the event in her cabin, speaking with her fiancé. Suddenly, the lights begin to flicker, and when she returns to the conversation, she realizes that the connection has been cut off. Meanwhile, Mia, Nancy, and Jackson are walking down a corridor on the ship. Nancy shares that she's been following them for years and booked the cruise only after learning they would be aboard. The bloggers are impressed by her dedication, and she suggests they come to her cabin to charge their phones. Just then, the professor rushes into Jackson, once again accusing him of being careless. He looks at Mia and laughs. Nancy, thinking the professor is also a fan, proudly mentions that they have 12 million followers. Upon hearing this, the professor's expression changes, and he immediately asks Nancy to leave. Mia, reacting quickly, tells the girl to stay and tells the professor that he needs to be more polite. The professor completely ignores her and says that he has a collection of Titanic relics, offering them for a reasonable price, especially a blue diamond that would suit her perfectly. Outraged by his behavior, Mia steps away and tells him not to touch her. Jackson then intervenes and forces the professor to leave. Before the concert begins, Julie gathers everyone's attention and announces that they have reached the site of the tragedy and will observe a moment of silence in honor of those who perished that day. At the same time, the girl continues her ritual. Once the moment of silence concludes, Julie thanks everyone and announces the start of the gala concert. Just as she does, the girl finishes her ritual, and Captain Edward Smith, her great-grandfather, appears before her. Meanwhile, Mia and Jackson decide to go out on the deck and film a video. Suddenly, Mia hears music, and a ghost with a violin appears behind them. Enchanted by the melody, she invites her husband to dance. As they dance, something strange happens on the ship. The electricity on the entire Titanic III goes out for a brief moment. As Mia continues dancing with her husband, the entire crew starts hearing a horrifying sound. Mia clutches her head and begs for it to stop. Jackson is confused and doesn't know how to help. The ghost with the violin is now right next to Mia. She desperately pleads for the sound to stop, but she doesn't notice that the ghost is pulling Jackson into the fog. Once the horrific sound ceases, the captain's assistant orders a ship-wide diagnostic check. Regaining her composure, Mia looks around, trying to find her husband. Instead, the professor approaches her. He tries to calm her down and suggests they go to the bar. She agrees but remembers her phone and returns for it, promising the professor she'll join him shortly. He leaves, and Mia picks up her phone, deciding to record a video to share what just happened. Suddenly, the ghostly violinist appears before her once again and emits a terrible sound, killing her instantly. The captain's assistant, having examined the equipment data, reports that the fog is too dense and the radar is picking it up as an object. Distracted by another instrument, he doesn't notice the strange flicker on the screen. Deciding to contact Rose, he fails to reach her. Ordering his colleague to keep an eye on the radar, he heads to the lounge to check on the woman. At this moment, one of the passengers, along with a professor, is inspecting a lifeboat from the wreckage site. She can't believe that people were once rescued on it. Wanting to distract her, the professor presents an old necklace. On the deck, 2 security guards find Mia. After inspecting her, they realize she's dead. Meanwhile, Parker arrives in the ballroom to see Captain Rose. She's surprised by his visit, but he tells her that she's needed up top. When they reach the bridge, she notices strange behavior with the instruments. She suggests trying to reboot the system. Suddenly, Brian bursts in, visibly worried, and asks the captain to come with him. Together, they head to the deck, where Mia's body lies. Upon seeing the dead woman, Rose asks where her husband is and tells Brian to check if she was live streaming on social media. It might help figure out what happened. A few minutes later, Hector arrives at the scene. He orders the guards to sweep the area and check all the cameras. The captain picks up the blogger's phone and asks the head of security to check who the last person she called was. Then, she heads to the bridge to report the incident to the Coast Guard. Meanwhile, one of the engineers is dealing with malfunctioning equipment. Suddenly, strange noises catch his attention. When he turns around, he sees people approaching him. Terrified, he tries to run, but it's no use. A ghost appears in front of him. With a thought, it rips a valve off a pipe, sending it flying and decapitating the engineer. Hector, Brian, and several guards are watching the cameras. Rose joins them, and they tell her that they didn't find anything suspicious, but they managed to hack into her phone. Handing it to her, they play the last video Mia recorded. The video doesn't show what happened to Jackson. It's as if he vanished into thin air. Then, they see Professor Cochrane approach Mia and invite her to the bar. He leaves, and Mia picks up her phone. Her expression reveals that she saw something terrifying, and right after that, she died. The captain speculates that Cochrane has returned, and it's time to interrogate him. At that moment, Professor Cochrane is talking to Julie in the ballroom. Rose and Brian approach him and tell him they need to speak with him in a private room. Not sure what they want, he follows them and learns that Mia Stone is dead and her husband is missing. He was the last person to see her alive, and they have surveillance footage showing him arguing with Jackson. He admits that he can be short-tempered sometimes, but nothing more. Brian suggests taking him to the brig to continue the questioning, and the captain agrees. The unknown girl in the hold uses her abilities again, and suddenly, the ship's engine starts running. Rose, who was about to observe Professor Cochrane's interrogation, feels the ship begin to move. She instructs the man to handle Cochrane on his own and hurries to the bridge. As soon as the door closes behind her, Brian angrily asks Cochrane when he'll learn to keep his mouth shut. Of course, he'll get him out of this mess, but now it'll be for 15%, not 10%. Cochrane argues, saying he's not willing to give up that much just for the guard bringing him clients. The most he'll give is 11%. After arguing back and forth, they settle on 13%, but Brian will now have to find clients with deeper pockets. Brian doesn't understand why Cochrane can't ever get enough money. What he's selling is junk. But Cochrane disagrees. These things have history attached to them, and while they mean nothing to him, they mean everything to the buyers. And as for the dead, they no longer care about them, because they're dead. After leaving his partner in the room, the guard walks out. As Rose walks along the deck, she realizes the ship is moving. She tries to radio Parker, but there's no response. When she reaches the bridge, she asks what's happening and why the ship is moving. The assistant replies that something is blocking their system, and they don't know what's going on. They've already rebooted the system, but it didn't help. Something else triggered the engines, and now the ship is moving on a different course. Furious, Rose orders them to engage reverse and fix the situation, while she heads to the deck. On the deck, Brian meets her, and they head down to the engine room together. Just as they leave, Julie and Mrs. Strauss step out onto the deck. Mrs. Strauss compliments the necklace around Julie's neck. As another woman walks by, they wait until Strauss is alone, and the ghost attacks her, strangling her with the necklace. In the engine room, Rose prepares to try and shut the throttle valve. Suddenly, she notices the engineer's body. Panicked, she tries to reach Parker, but the radio is malfunctioning again. Realizing they need to shut the ship down immediately, she begins to troubleshoot the systems. But nothing works. The computer is frozen, and they can't move the valve. Brian notices that the engines can't withstand the pressure and insists they need to leave. However, Rose refuses to leave just yet. She has to neutralize the throttle valve first. Seeing that the system is about to explode, Brian grabs the captain and rushes out of the engine room. As the door slams shut behind them, a powerful explosion erupts. In the ballroom, passengers fall to the floor from the violent jolt. After recovering from their initial shock, they start asking what happened. Regaining her composure, Rose says they need to warn the others immediately. There's a bit of panic in the bridge, and the crew is confused about what's happening. Someone suggests it might have been an iceberg. However, Rose denies it, as the instruments show that one of the engines has failed. Parker tries to contact the captain, but she doesn't respond. Just a few minutes later, Rose walks into the bridge. Regina informs her that there's an iceberg ahead on their current course. The assistant says that, at the moment, they are drifting with the current, and even if they collide, the impact won't be strong enough to damage the ship. Brian starts to panic slightly, but the captain orders Parker to try reaching other ships. Meanwhile, Hector inspects the engine room, being watched by the ghost. On the bridge, Parker is still trying to establish communication with someone. Seeing that nothing is working, Rose addresses the passengers, informing them that one of the ship's engines has failed. She asks them not to panic and to remain in their cabins while the engineers work on the problem. Suddenly, the Coast Guard establishes contact. The captain reports the issue and requests a tugboat. After hanging up, she tells her crew that the nearest ship is 2 hours away. Giving instructions to everyone, Rose heads to her cabin to contact the corporation. Meanwhile, Cochrane is locked in his room. Suddenly, he notices water dripping from the ceiling. The lights flicker and go out, and he starts hearing terrifying sounds. In a panic, he pleads for it to stop. When the noise stops, he sees the ghost standing before him. Terrified, he jumps into the opposite corner of the room, begging the apparition to leave. But the ghost binds his hands to the bedposts and exhales its cold breath on him. On the bridge, Nancy bursts in to talk to the captain. She insists she has something important to say. Rose decides to listen, and Nancy reveals that the ghost killed Mia. To prove it, she shows the last video from the blogger's phone. However, Rose doesn't believe her and reassures her that there are no ghosts on the Titanic III. She then asks Brian to escort Nancy back to her cabin and decides not to release Cochrane yet. He won't go anywhere, and when they arrive, she'll request that the authorities question him. After the announcement, passengers head to their cabins. Brian goes to fetch Cochrane. When he enters the room, he finds the man twisted and lying on the floor in a dazed state. In a disoriented condition, Cochrane pleads for him to stay away. As soon as they help him to his feet, he asks to be taken to the captain. Leading Cochrane to Rose, he explains that he saw some strange creature. He doesn't know what it was, but it felt like death itself was close by. Furious about being locked up alone, the man threatens her with lawyers and demands that they turn the ship around and return to New York. At that moment, one of the guards enters and says he couldn't find Hector anywhere. The captain asks Brian to escort the professor back to his cabin and then go with Sykes to the engine room to search for Hector. The men leave, and Rose tries to reach the head of security over the radio. The guards lead Cochrane to his cabin, and along the way, they encounter a strange girl. The professor immediately recognizes her as the one who had been lingering around his collection. He accuses her of everything that's been happening. However, the girl denies killing the couple but says she knows what's going on. She believes they aren't ready to hear the truth. Brian insists on an answer and suggests testing her. The girl then points to Cochrane and claims it's all his fault. When he dug up tombs and stole the dead's belongings, everything started again. At first, she thought everything had settled down, and the voices in her head had started to fade. Ever since her great-grandfather died on this ship, she only had rare nightmares. But now, since Cochrane disturbed the graves and began selling their things, the voices have returned, and this ship is cursed. Cochrane, panicked, asks how to stop it, but the girl says it's too late, it's his curse now, to watch as everyone around him dies. The guard escorts Cochrane back to his cabin, but unexpectedly, they see a ghost ahead. The man quickly hides behind a corner, while the constable tries to talk to the apparition. However, he fails to communicate, and the ghost kills him. Cochrane cautiously peeks around the corner but sees that the guard is gone, replaced by the ghost. In a panic, he runs off in the opposite direction. Meanwhile, Brian leads the girl to a room. She says it won't help and that they're all going to die anyway. A minute later, the doors close on their own, and Edward Smith appears in the room. Brian shoots at him, but the bullet hits his partner instead. At that moment, the power on the ship cuts out completely. Turning on flashlights, Rose spots the ghost. Screaming in fear, she orders everyone to point their flashlights at the wall, but when they do, the space is empty. Thinking she must have imagined it, she tells everyone to return to fixing the system. Edward Smith transfers some of his power to his great-granddaughter, and Brian, who watches in horror, can do nothing. Once the ghost is finished, the girl turns to the guard and knocks him unconscious. She then calmly leaves the room. Cochrane, in a panic, runs back to his cabin and decides to get rid of his entire collection. Trying to calm down, he heads to the bathroom to wash his face and sees Mia's ghost. Brian comes to his senses, confirming that his partner is alive, and steps out of the room to seek help. However, the second man decides not to wait for backup, and as soon as he steps into the corridor, he encounters a ghost that kills him. Meanwhile, the girl reaches the bridge. Using her powers, she throws Parker aside. Rose also tries to stop her, but as soon as she touches the girl, she sees the ghost of Edward Smith. After this, the girl pushes the captain away and takes control of the ship, confidently steering Titanic III toward the iceberg. The woman begs her to stop, telling her that she is no longer the captain and that the death of all the passengers won't bring him back to life. But he doesn't react, and the other crew members fail to regain control of the ship. Rose then makes a last-ditch effort to reach the great-granddaughter, telling her that if the ship crashes, she will die with the rest. Smiling, the girl replies that she knows and slashes her throat. Moments later, the ship crashes into the massive iceberg. Julie tries to calm the passengers and guide them to the assembly area. Rose desperately tries to contact anyone, but no one answers. Her attempts are interrupted by Cochrane, who enters and says he knows what's going on. To stop all of this, the artifacts need to be returned to the depths, but the woman refuses to listen, telling him that if he wants to help, he should go help the passengers and assist them with boarding the lifeboats. Titanic III sinks rapidly, and panic erupts on board. At this moment, Brian steals a portion of the collection from the hull. However, he doesn't get far before Mia's ghost appears in front of him. Using her powers, she forces the guard to shoot himself in the head. The ship is already more than halfway submerged in water, and Rose tries to organize the evacuation. Assigning part of the process to Cochrane, she heads to another part of the ship. The water is already flooding the corridors, and panic is escalating. In the ballroom, Julia finds Brian, but he has already turned into a ghost and drops a lifeboat onto her. The professor pulls himself together and starts helping people. The lifeboats are ready to be lowered, but the ropes holding them are cut by the ghost's powers, and people fall into the water. Rose stays on Titanic III until the very end. The ship completely sinks. A trembling Cochrane lies in the lifeboat. Suddenly, he hears a voice. It's the surviving captain. The woman asks for help, and he pulls her into the boat. Lying on the bottom of the boat, the man laughs, considering it a cruel irony that the others died while he survived. Rose tries to calm him, saying that he helped people escape, so he needs to let it go and deal with God later. After listening to her, the professor says a few words and falls silent. Turning to him, the captain sees that he is dead. A few moments later, he also turns into a ghost and kills Rose. If someone ever decides to recreate the Titanic in our real life, would you go on a cruise on it following the same route? Share your thoughts in the comments down below, give a thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next videos.